The prompt for this event is as follows. The Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz once wrote that war is a continuation of politics by other means. Wars have been a persistent feature of capitalism and have historically presented the left with possibilities for advance or regression. The present conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza raise the specter of previous wars central to the history of the left and its politics. These include the American Civil War, World War I, the Spanish Civil War, the Vietnam War, and the Iraq War, as well as the historical categories used to understand such wars, especially imperialism, national liberation, and solidarity. Why are there wars in capitalism? How have the categories of imperialism, national liberation, and solidarity changed for the left historically? And what is their relevance today? What obstacles and opportunities does war present for the left? What difference in political tasks, if any, do wartime versus peacetime present for the left? And should the left demand one over the other? What are the politics of war? Now, to my side, we have three speakers who will be speaking in the order of their distance from me. First is Benjamin Studebaker, formerly of the podcast What's Left. He has a PhD from the University of Cambridge and is the author of the recently published book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut. Les Slater was born into a working-class family in 1943 in the middle of World War II. His father was a coal truck driver and member of the Teamsters Union. He originally identified as a Republican and voted for Barry Goldwater in 1964. Les joined the U.S. Air Force and later volunteered to transfer to the Army to become a combat helicopter pilot. In 1964, he began questioning his support for the Vietnam War and American democracy. While living in the hotbed of student radicalism in Boston, by 1970, he became self-described ultra-left anti-imperialist. In 1971, he sobered up to the futility of ultra-leftism and joined the Young Socialist Alliance, the group of the Socialist Workers' Party, and in May 1972, he was voted into membership of the party. Next is Bruce Perry, a 1968 graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He saw combat in Vietnam with the 1st Battalion, 8th Cavalry of the 1st Cavalry Division from 1969 to 1971. He received numerous awards for valor and for his service in Vietnam. He served 3 additional years after Vietnam, and he then earned a doctorate in economics and taught at the University of Baltimore. He has been active in the veterans movement and the social movement for peace and justice since 1974. He is currently the Veterans Coordinator for the National Union of the Homeless, and organizes with the Illinois Union of the Homeless and the Poor People's Campaign. Now, the structure of the panel will be as follows. Each of the 3 panelists will give opening remarks, which are roughly 10 to 12 minutes. They will then be given 2 to 3 minutes to respond to each other's remarks, which will be followed then by a Q&A session in which we'll open up questions to the audience, which will run until the end of the panel. Ben, if you want to take it away.
All right. Hopefully I'm loud enough. Everybody can hear me? Good? All right. Our prompt begins with the famous Clausewitz quote, "War is politics by other means." Today I want to suggest to you that war is work by other means, that soldiers are workers. Through the soldier's labor, the soldier contributes to the political power of the state. This is alienated labor in the straightforward sense that while soldiers produce state power, they are not able to wield it. Modern soldiers exercise very little influence over the ways they are used. Sometimes soldiers attempt to overcome this alienation to seize state power for themselves. But soldiers often find that when they perform coups and establish military juntas, this just puts their commanding officers in charge. The officers might reward them with raises and bonuses, but this does not put state power into their hands. At most, they become a kind of militarized professional class, performing a mediating role between ruling commanders and civilian subjects, a bit like the Mamluks. When soldiers go it alone, there are stark limits on what they can achieve. Ultimately, they can only overcome alienation through solidarity with the rest of the working class. They express solidarity by refusing to shoot striking workers. Sooner or later, if strikes are sufficiently intense and widespread, the rulers will panic and call out the troops. If the soldiers refuse to follow orders, if they defect and go over to the workers, that is the moment in which revolution actually becomes possible. The more solidarity there is between the workers and the soldiers, the more uniformly the soldiers will defect. This is critical because if defection isn't sufficiently uniform, you get civil war. To win a civil war, the revolutionary movement will have to become thoroughly militarized, and that will affect the kind of state you can create when the war is finished. In an ideal case, all of the soldiers defect together, and the strength of the defection causes the ruling class to lose heart and surrender without the need for very much violence at all. The way we fight wars matters a great deal because it affects the level of solidarity between the soldiers and the civilian workers. In the 20th century, states relied on mass mobilization armies. They conscripted millions of young men to serve in gigantic existential world wars. These wars were so vast in scale that they made a mess of global trade. Their existential character enabled states to raise taxes and borrow money on an unprecedented scale. The capitalist class lost a substantial chunk of its wealth in these wars. Its assets were blown up, taxed, or inflated away. The soldiers who fought in these wars saw things we cannot imagine. Never before in Western modernity had so many citizens been so thoroughly accustomed to violence as an ordinary part of life. Most of these soldiers were drawn from the working class, and when they returned home, they became veterans. The veteran is a civilian worker who has been a soldier. The more veterans there are, the more overt and obvious the connection between the worker and the soldier. Veterans are living expressions of solidarity. The more veterans are involved in the left, the more soldiers will sympathize with it. The changes we saw in the Western capitalist states, the creation of pension programs, jobs programs, healthcare systems, cheap university education, and so on, were a direct response not merely to the labor movement, but to the level of solidarity that existed between the labor movement and the soldiers. The Russian Revolution was only possible because soldiers defected. In 1932, veterans of the First World War marched on Washington, demanding the federal government pay them bonuses. Douglas MacArthur served as Army Chief of Staff during the Hoover administration. He believed that the veterans were communists, that there was a communist conspiracy brewing among veterans in the major cities of the country, and that because these communists were veterans, there was a very real chance that active duty troops would refuse to shoot them. In point of fact, the left had not done a very good job of getting involved with the veterans. Most of the veterans would have been perfectly happy to accept employment or government checks. But MacArthur felt a show of force was necessary. He sent out tanks to bulldoze the protest camp. Even though the demonstrators were veterans, the soldiers carried out MacArthur's orders. But the veterans didn't give up. They sent another contingent to Washington in 1933. On that occasion, President Roosevelt offered the veterans jobs in the Civilian Conservation Corps, and that was enough to get them to disperse. A few years later, in 1936, Democrats in Congress remained concerned that veterans posed an existential threat to the state. They voted to pay the veterans their bonuses. President Roosevelt vetoed the measure, but the Democrats were so determined they overrode the veto. Nothing scares the state more than soldiers and civilians in solidarity with one another. In the 20th century, we saw this solidarity develop to an unprecedented degree. But despite this, MacArthur's men followed orders. Despite this, the veterans dispersed when offered jobs. Despite this, some cash from Congress was enough to calm things down. The American state was never in very much danger, even during the period in which the workers enjoyed maximum leverage and the most solidarity from soldiers they have ever enjoyed. It's for this reason that the post-war concessions in the United States were limited in scope, and it's for this reason that most of those concessions could be so easily revoked. Even so, neoliberal economic reforms could not be easily pursued without doing something to diminish feelings of solidarity between workers and soldiers. The Vietnam War weakened the left by estranging the left from the soldiers. The left became critical not just of the war, but of the men who volunteered to fight in the war, and eventually even of the men who obeyed draft orders. By blaming and shaming individual soldiers for fighting in the Vietnam War, the left made it impossible for many soldiers to feel at home in it. President Nixon capitalized on this burgeoning split by abolishing the draft. Without the draft, every person who serves as a soldier can be framed as a volunteer, and that makes it easier for the soldier to be blamed and vilified. If we attempt to resist this by suggesting the soldier has been forced by poverty or precarity to fight, we appear condescending. If we go out of our way to avoid being seen to criticize the soldier, we are accused by others in the left of supporting imperialist war. Our society has become so implacably liberal individualist that condemnation of individuals is not just expected, but politically demanded. This same individualism makes it very difficult to reinstitute the draft. The draft, it is argued, takes away our choice about whether to serve. It deprives us of the right to form our own judgments about American foreign policy, to withhold our participation if we disagree. But individuals refusing to serve does nothing to change our foreign policy. The refusals only succeed in showing the troops that we have contempt for their decision to serve. They only succeed in destroying solidarity. In recent years, the state has become adept at using fewer and fewer Western soldiers to accomplish its goals. Fighting is outsourced to soldiers from other lands. Drones and missiles are operated from the comfort of home. As the state develops ever more elaborate ways of delivering its packages, its reliance on a large body of citizen soldiers ebbs away. Before too long, it will not be necessary to ask the soldier to shoot the striker. There will be a computer ready and willing to act, programmed to understand that this is just how any state would behave in such a situation. I mean, after all, states have a right to defend themselves. In turning on the soldier, we have turned on ourselves. We have made revolution impossible, and in making revolution impossible, we have emboldened the state, not just to wage war abroad, but to slowly abandon the already inadequate suite of public services it once provided. Our criticisms of President Biden's foreign policy are irrelevant to him unless they are backed by a credible threat of political action. The left, which has no connection to the soldiers and little connection to the workers at this stage, cannot mobilize the public to oppose Biden's foreign policy. Even if the left could generate meaningfully disruptive demonstrations, there is no chance that the soldiers will go over to the demonstrators if they are ordered to put a stop to them. This makes the whole conversation about imperialism incredibly pointless, more pointless than it has ever been in the history of the left. That scholars and media personalities who do speak out often lose their jobs only serves to further underline the degree to which this foreign policy is carried out with impunity. It does not indicate, as so many wish it did, that the state has anything to fear from the commentariat. Astonishingly, we have become so irrelevant that the populations of weak states have more influence over American foreign policy than we ourselves do. And by this, I don't just mean the Israelis. The United States knows that if Israel displaces the Palestinians into Egypt, the president of Egypt will face an acute threat of revolution unless he is seen to do something about it. Just a decade ago, the citizens of the Middle Eastern states rose against their governments and, in many cases, won the support of their soldiers. This fact terrifies the leaders of the Middle Eastern countries, and when they tell President Biden that their citizens won't allow them to stand idly by or to be seen to aid and abet the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, President Biden cannot simply dismiss their concerns. He must insist Israel show restraint, because if he does not, who knows? The Suez Canal may be closed. There may be another oil embargo. There may even be a wider war. In those circumstances, President Biden may very well lose the next election. In the Middle East, workers and soldiers know how to hold hands, and that gives them more influence than all the influencers on Twitter and TikTok combined. They have the courage and conviction to face imprisonment and death, while our leading lights worry about losing patrons or getting kicked out of their university jobs. Our so-called left produces only sound and fury, signifying nothing. To become something, the left would have to offer soldiers a life for which it's worth risking their own. For the danger the soldier endures in refusing to shoot the demonstrator is more than most of us can fathom, and far more than most of us would willingly endure. The soldier who, having lived a violent life, refuses to do violence to the fellow in the street, that is what we used to call a comrade. If you would call such a man by some other name, you're no comrade of mine.
Thank you, Ben. Les?
It was mentioned in the introducing me that I was born in the middle of World War II. So the first memories of that I began to, as I grew a little bit older, 4, 5, 6 years old, were the political question: why did the German people allow Hitler to come to power? So I was started in life with a very political orientation, but I was living in a working class family, and the habits of a working class family trained me, imbued me to understand the working class. But I sort of took a detour for quite a few years. It was mentioned that I became a Republican at, 10 years old or something like that, and actually voted for Barry Goldwater when I became 21. And sort of became a middle class, looking for all kinds of perks and good jobs and things like that. And then I went to the extreme left, the ultra left, but I still had the same middle class views at that point from getting out of the home and getting good jobs and so forth in my case, electronics industry. And it wasn't until quite a few years after I saw the futility of the ultra-leftism, and that was mainly from the May Day demonstration in 1971, where the revolutionaries were going to close down the Pentagon, and their tactics were to throw nails in the streets, drive around in pickup trucks and just throw nails out of buckets in the streets, and that was going to close down the Pentagon. Well, I think there was over 10,000 people that were rounded up and put into a soccer stadium. Sort of reminds you of 9/11, the Chilean 9/11, where a lot of the people were put into soccer stadiums and quite often killed after that. So I was very much enthused with the revolutionaries, the ones that put their bodies on the line and even sympathized with some of the bombers and so forth. But that May Day demonstration, I realized that these people were not serious. They had no political outlook that could possibly be. So basically, I started a sharp turn toward radical politics, namely Marxism. And in the case of me personally, it was a Socialist Workers' Party. That was in the early 70s. And one of the first books I read was a book by Leon Trotsky called In Defense of Marxism. And in this book, I sided with the opposition to Trotsky, as I was still a middle-class outlook type of person. And Trotsky was being attacked for being sentimental, that he's sort of a has-been and so forth. This was in the leading up to 1940, 38, 40. And as I read the book, I noticed that Trotsky was very persistent and said the differences in politics were based on the fact that some were workers and some were intellectuals, academics, and so forth. And he also talked about the dialectics of politics. So what the conclusion of the book, In Defense of Marxism, the opponents of Trotsky pretty much admitted that Trotsky was correct. So at that point, I recognized that I had a middle class perspective on things, and I realized that was a serious shortcoming on my part. So since then, I've been attempting to look at things from a working class perspective. And I think the main thing that we have to realize in this question of war, including the most recent ones, which they are many, it's not just Israel and Gaza. If you even want to call that a war, it's a slaughter more than anything. But there's a lot of things going on, and not just Ukraine. There's, all over Africa and other parts of the Middle East and so forth. You have to look at all of these things from the perspective of what is necessary and in the interest of the international working class. And this is what determines what you should be seeking in politics. And I just want to disagree with you a little bit on what happened during the anti-Vietnam War. There was two major coalitions at the time, the National Peace Action Coalition, which I was a member of and somewhat of a leader, and also the People's Coalition of Peace and Justice. NPAC was one, and the other one was PCGB, whatever. And the organization I was in, which was the dominant anti-war organization, was very careful not to blame the soldiers, that they were under orders, they were part of the propaganda machine and so forth. And we saw some instances of people turning against the soldiers and blaming them. And it's just not reasonable at all for a political person to do that. So the people that were blaming these people were not very clear on their thinking. So on the question of war, let's just look at the 20th century and into the 21st century. We had World War I, and we had the Russian Revolution. We had the German Revolution of 1919, and its ultimate success and then followed by failure, and how this has affected politics ever since. And also the rise of Stalin because of the civil war in Russia, where 90% of industry was destroyed, and also 90% of the working class. The work was mostly a peasant country, so the working class went to the front lines in defending their government, and 90% of them were killed, and a lot of careerists joined the Bolshevik Party, and they had their own interest because of scarcity and so forth. So again, it's how much time doing?
You've got 3-ish minutes. 3-ish minutes, roughly 3.
Okay. In the more recent wars or attacks on people, like the Palestinians, we have to look at it being part of the world imperialist and lesser powers fighting each other, that these powers don't care about the lives of Jews or Palestinians. They're pawns for economic, trade, and so forth issues. So anyway, I think I'll stop there and we can discuss it.
Thank you, Les.
Questions?
Yeah, I'm Bruce Parry. Among other things, 3 years younger than he is, but I'm a Vietnam vet, and actually, I voted for Nixon. And the reason I voted for Nixon was he had a plan for ending the war. At least he campaigned on a plan for ending the war. And Hubert Humphrey, who was running against him, didn't. It was going to continue the war. So I voted for Nixon. But such is life. Vietnam radicalized me. When I left the country, I knew two things. First of all, everyone in my unit knew that we were fighting everybody in the country. And if you are fighting everybody in the country and you believe in democracy, you're on the wrong side. I came home knowing that. The second thing I knew was that the basic problem facing the Vietnamese peasantry was land distribution, and that the capitalists would not redistribute land and could not redistribute land, and the communists could and would, and therefore the communists were going to win. So I came back with those two things, and I had 3 more years in the Army I had to spend, and I was totally at odds with everybody else in the Army. And so I got out and became, basically joined the Communist Labor Party in the 1970s, later 1970s. All of that is to say that I devoted my life from that point on to the fight, to the defense of democracy, and all that implies. And that's what has brought me to where I am today. The question that was posed was, war is a continuation of politics by other means, by Clausewitz. He said that in 1776, I believe. That is, fundamental, but it's also a continuation of economics. And the capitalist system generates war, and it generates it because of markets, basically, and resources. It goes to war over resources. The Middle East, goes over oil, and any place else, Africa. There are 800 bases. The U.S. holds 800 bases around the world, and it does that to control the resources and to control the politics of various countries. And when those countries try to remove their markets from the influence of the United States or Western Europe or Japan, what have you, then they go to war. So you take a country like Libya, and the United States went to war in Libya. It's divided Libya. They killed Gaddafi, who was the leader of Gaddafi. What people don't know is that Libya had the most equal income distribution of any country in Africa at that time. And that's what we bombed. We killed people that were about an equal distribution of wealth. And if you look at the wars that the U.S. foments, the Ukrainian war is actually a U.S. war against Russia. And my position on Gaza is it's a slave revolt. And the U.S. is supporting Israel in the destruction of those that have been oppressed and exploited in the most horrific situation for years. So that's, and I actually, some years ago, published an article with this Wikipedia listing of all the wars that the U.S. has been in since 1990. That's just from 1990 to 2017. So I went up on Wikipedia to get an update, and that seems to be gone. They don't seem to have that anymore. So I had just brought my copy. The U.S. has been in continuous war at least from 1989. And war is in peace or in war. The military is very good for their economy, right? You were talking about they blow things up and they destroy their capital. Those are commodities. They blow things up, they have to replace them. So it becomes a continual system of economic replenishment. It's very much less effective than it was in, for instance, World War II or even in Vietnam, because the military is so capital intensive today that very few jobs are created by that. So it isn't stabilizing the economy. In fact, it is destabilizing the economy. That's what I have to say about the causes of war, other than revolutionary war. Obviously, in a situation like Gaza and a situation in many other places around the world where the contradictions of capitalism become antagonistic, then, and the working class is organized and led by a revolutionary core, then the people rise up and there's a revolutionary war, and that is a justifiable war. I believe that the Civil War in the United States was a revolutionary war. It was led by the left wing of it was led by the abolitionists, and it took studying it is extremely important. And the period afterward became a reconstruction and was one of the periods of the greatest democracy in this country. Public schools, public health systems, and things like that were the result of black and white unity of poor blacks and poor whites across the South, and started actually rebuilding a society that was defeated. And the first Reconstruction was defeated, right? And that didn't rise again until the Civil Rights Movement, and the Civil Rights Movement was also defeated. We have the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And those are under attack today. And we actually have less voting rights today than we did back in 1964 and 1965. So if that was the second effort at Reconstruction, we are today in the third effort of Reconstruction. And there are 140 million people in poverty or near poverty in this country. It's about 43% of the country. The economy is generating poverty, and it is doing that because electronics and the internet, and today AI, and all of the other reorganization of industry is actually generating labor replacement, is actually generating poverty by throwing people out of work. And then with large numbers of people out of work, the labor force, I'm an economist, by the way, that didn't get mentioned. I'm an economist, so I look at the economics of the thing. Labor force participation rate and the employment population ratio have been falling. And with more people out of the labor force and unemployed, wages tend to fall. 52% of the population of the working people make less than $15 an hour. 44% of the new jobs pay less than $18,000. We're talking about the growth of poverty, and this growth of poverty is concentrated particularly in the South, but it's everywhere. And 140 million people is a whole bunch of people, and that's that's what's developing today, and that's what the core of a revolutionary movement in this country is. And that's why I work with the Poor People's Campaign, that is aimed at organizing the poor people in a nonviolent way today, which I think is correct tactic for this period. And they're fighting for the rights of poor and working people. The leading edge of poverty today is homelessness. So I'm also working with the Illinois Union of the Homeless to try to organize the homeless in their own behalf. It's the Illinois Union of the Homeless, not for the homeless. That's different. There's a fundamental difference.
2 minutes.
Okay, and that's why I'm working with those organizations in order to bring the contradictions in this country to a head, and that's pretty much what I do, and that's what I'm about today. And anybody's interested, I can talk more about that as we get into it.
Great. Give me 1 second. We can begin the Q&A. So each panelist, in the same order as they were presenting, can respond to the other panelists' remarks. And then afterwards, we'll open up with the Q&A. I meant comments, my bad.
Okay. So just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that everybody who protested the Vietnam War blamed soldiers personally. only that this kicked off and became much more common during the Vietnam War, and that this tendency continues to afflict us and has afflicted us in worse and worse and worse ways over the last 50 years. So I'm not accusing you or your organization or any particular person or organization of doing it. I'm just pointing out a trend that I think began with Vietnam and has been, if anything, gaining steam ever since. I also had some thoughts about causes of war. One of the things that I think is helpful in thinking about this, sometimes when we talk about the causes of war, we treat capital as a kind of monolithic thing. But wars happen because there's intra-elite conflict. There's conflict within capital. Now that can straightforwardly be at the level of the elites of different states. But I also think it's worth bearing in mind that different sectors within the same state will often have different positions with respect to war. So for instance, if you are a sector that really benefits from capital mobility, like say the financial sector, where the fact that it's easy to move money around the world, that really helps you make a ton of money, you're not going to support conflicts that are potentially disruptive to that mobility, and you're going to try to resist efforts to start or kick off a war. If you are a sector that is less able to take advantage of mobility, say that you mainly sell whatever it is that you produce to the domestic market, to workers in the United States, then you might resent the fact that these workers in the United States are having to compete for wages with workers overseas, because that means that your consumers don't have enough money to buy your goods locally. And you might resent the foreign states that you implicate or blame for the fact that your local market is weaker than you'd like it to be. And for that reason, you might support a politics of disrupting the mobility, disrupting the trade, and potentially escalating to conflict. War is especially likely to happen when you're dealing with something that is fixed geographically, where you have to control the land to get the thing. So something like oil, because it's fixed geographically, you have to control the land. If you don't control the land, you can't have the oil. There's no other way around it. Whoever controls the land has got the oil. For that reason, petrol states that control oil usually have a greater level of autonomy from the international system than other kinds of states. The fact that they have oil gives them a bargaining chip. But even with that bargaining chip, we've seen that states that have relied on oil as the basis of their refusing to participate in the international system struggle in the long term to survive, given the enormous power disparity between those states and the leading capitalist states.
You have another minute.
Yeah. That's really the bulk of what I would like to say here is we have to think about sectors and not just national elites, but within states there's plurality, and rich people, capitalists, often do not agree about foreign policy. And so to really get at why is this policy happening, you have to kind of dig into where are these different sectors positioned, which are the sectors that are becoming more important. Sometimes a new sector is becoming more important in a state, and that will have an effect on its foreign policy. For instance, the tech sector in the United States, as it becomes stronger, it has more influence on foreign policy. Early on, the tech sector's attitude toward China is this is a great way to get cheap labor to make iPhones. Now the attitude is China's stealing our intellectual property, and we don't like that. That shift in attitude to China can be an early indicator of a possibility that that industry, which previously would have opposed conflict with China, might flip and develop a more bellicose attitude.
Great. Les?
On the differences in ruling class sectors and so forth, I want to briefly discuss that, especially since the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, Gaza in particular. I've been watching the news very carefully, and it looks like there's a lot of discussion going on and disagreement, and people are pretending things and other people are calling them out, and so it's an interesting situation. But on the question of soldiers, whether they're inclined to fire on workers, or in this country, or participate in wars in other countries. In the Vietnam War, and you may know this, there was a lot of fragging going on at a certain point. At a certain point, you didn't want to be the last one to be killed. And there were, from my understanding, quite a few cases where officers would say, "Follow me," and get shot from behind by their own troops. And I've heard stories about putting grenades in helicopters and things like that. I'm glad I didn't end up a helicopter combat pilot. The other thing, which I think is very important, and this is looking at the working class, is, and other oppressed classes. In the case of the Russian Revolution and the armies, the Bolsheviks had representatives in all kinds of units all over the place, and there was a dual power in Russia, and that the troops were quite often looking to their Bolshevik leaders within the troops to on what to do, and there was a lot of going back and forth with German troops between the Russians and Germans. The other thing is the big problem with the working class right now in this country and most other advanced capitalist countries is they support their own ruling classes, their own capitalist ruling classes. In this case, it boils down to we got to vote for Biden. We just have to. Because Trump's going to get in again. And that's a pretty sorry excuse for voting for Biden. But the left is pushing this. The progressives are pushing this. And we have to call them out on this. This is really the wrong way to go. We have to come up with our own political party, a working class party. And based on the unions, and as far as the South is concerned, it's very encouraging. There's the auto industry and other industries are being unionized. And unions are becoming a lot more popular nowadays than they were before. So anyway.
Bruce, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think the following two thoughts. First of all, I am not interested in organizing the left. The left is just all over the place. I'm interested in organizing the working class. That is a fundamentally different thing. And I think the only way to do that, the second point, is to find out what the interests are of the working class itself, of the people themselves, right? As I said, there are 140 million people in or near poverty in this country, and their interest is in getting health care, in getting, having jobs, of course, having housing, having education for their kids, and things like that, all of which are being taken away. And we can get them to vote in their own interests. And that, the presidential election is one aspect of that, but there are also more local elections and there are congressional elections as well. And we can start influencing. The electoral arena is historically super important in this country, and many people ignore that fact. But even, for instance, the Civil War was precipitated by the election of Abraham Lincoln. This is, if you look at American history is about what is legal, what isn't legal, what needs to be legal, what needs not to be legal, and fought out on that basis. And so we need to be in the electoral arena as well as in the streets.
Great. All right, so we are going to open up the discussion to questions and answers. I would like to ask that people try to keep their comments to a minimum. If that isn't possible, at least finish with a question mark. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Right, so I'll start with, I'm 23 years old, just graduated college, and I joined the IBEW Local 134, the Electricians Workers Union in Chicago, one of the strongest unions in the city, also in the country. And you guys brought this up so clearly, and kind of clarify my overarching question of like socialism and how we build socialism in the future. So you said, Les, that unions and the working class are how we build the working class party, but some of the strongest unions in this country, including mine, a lot of our work right now, I work in a data center. Data centers are places that support AI and support big finance and the space race to quicker financial transactions. So like our union, a lot of our jobs right now of our 10,000 plus local union and the locals around us and around the country are built on Google, Facebook, and this continued industry that what you said is degrading jobs. So like this continued growth of capitalism, and so also like with the soldiers, the people in manufacturing plants in this country for guns and bombs, they're union jobs. And those are also very strong unions. And so like these very strong unions in our country, the strongest of the working class, is predicated on the system of war, the system of replacing other people's jobs, of making other people poor. Yeah, I'm great. I'll make a salary of $120,000 a year with $50,000 worth of benefits every year. But at what cost? And can the socialist future support my current job? And so my question becomes, what do these soldiers do for work when the war is over? If socialism wins, if we're going to get rid of AI, get rid of all these things, what do I do for work? And maybe this is a lack of imagination, so what's the future? I'm trying to imagine a positive future. What do the soldiers, when the war is over, what do they come back to, and what are they doing to produce a more equitable, less exploitative version of our world? So I'm what can I tell the worker? What can I tell myself? What can I tell people I'm working with? That if you support worker involvement, that there's going to be something to do after the exploitation is over. Because I don't want the workers to just be a part, to have more say in the exploitation. For me to just say, the current system is great, I just need more say in the exploitation. We want the exploitation to end, so how does that happen with our workers? I think help me explain that, what I see as this contradiction.
I want to be clear, I'm not against technology. I'm not a Luddite. And the technology is the mobile aspect of the thing. It's going to continue to advance. The problem is that we can no longer provide health care and housing and food and clothing through jobs only. We need to look at provision. The provision of health care is an extremely good example. It's provided basically through people having a job. 87 million people in this country don't have any health care, right? Because many of them don't have jobs. We need to start providing the basic necessities of life in other ways than through work. And we have to start looking at cutting back, going from the 40-hour work week, which is a myth anyway, down, to more part-time work, working less, but for the same or improved wages. And furthermore, I don't think that most of the workers, the ones I deal with, the people I deal with, aren't worried about what's going to happen after socialism. They're worried about whether they're going to get a meal today, whether they're going to get a paycheck next week. One of our slogans is, we are one paycheck away from homelessness, right? People they have no security. They lack security in their, within their lives. And we need to fight for the very things that they're fighting for. They're already fighting on some level. They're attempting on some level to fight. We need to fight for what they're fighting for.
Can I answer that also?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm also not a Luddite, and also I've studied AI pretty closely, and it's one of my subjects that I know quite a bit about. What we need is not just individual unions what we need is a political party based on the working class through unions that have formations that can discuss these issues. The working class needs health care. There's no doubt about it. I mean, every worker, there may be some exceptions, but workers need health care. They need good education, they need safe neighborhoods, etc. And we need to discuss this on a large scale and point out that the ruling class representatives, like Biden and everybody else, Johnson here in Chicago, there in Chicago, that's not their priority. Their priority is to support the capitalist class and their tools of the capitalist class. We can discuss this, and taking power, running elections, take political power, make the Democrat and Republican parties the number 2 and number 3 parties, and the working class party, Labor Party, be number 1. So anyway, that's briefly.
So, Bruce, if I can ask, you raise your activism around domestic issues, workers, access to health care, labor security, these sorts of things. And I'm wondering, do you see a relationship between U.S. policies around warfare and these domestic issues at home? And in particular, it seems that periodic crisis globally, you note that the U.S. has functionally been at war constantly since at least the 90s, but you have these escalations where it seems that international conflict takes the spotlight, even in domestic politics. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to connect the condition of the domestic working class with war? Is that necessary? Is it something that should be brought into consideration in solidarity politics during these sort of moments of especially heated discussion and tension?
Yeah, the Poor People's Campaign has 5 pillars. The fight against poverty, systemic poverty, the fight against systemic racism, the fight against ecological devastation of our communities and the planet, and to change the distorted moral narrative in this country, particularly of religious nationalism. And the 5th one is to end the war economy and to take money out of the war economy to solve some of these problems. I mean, I think that's a very concrete way to approach this question. And you can, and you're right, some wars are pretty much go on and people aren't paying any attention to them whatsoever, and others galvanize people and need to be brought into the discussion. But anytime we can bring up 10% of the military budget, cut the military budget, would pay for most of the things that we're talking about. That would be $100 billion right there.
Questions?
What exactly is the left?
In case anyone wasn't able to hear, the question was, what is the left? Go for it. Yeah.
In my opinion, it's a reactionary. One of the things I said earlier is that much of the left is trying to figure out who's the least dangerous, and the left is mostly defined by what it is not, and that is, it's very seldom working class, and often it fears the working class. It fears becoming part of the working class, and too often hates the working class. And we should, anybody that's like myself at a certain point, I started out working class but became middle class and sort of affluent to a certain extent. It wasn't until I started looking at the working class and becoming part of the working class that I began to be able to think clearly. So I think the left being mostly middle class is a problem, and many go into academics, and that is also a problem.
Would anyone
I'll
else
just-
like to? Oh, Bruce.
Yeah, I'll just respond very practically. It has two meanings. One is in the political spectrum, in the political arena, it's the grouping that is more in favor of poor and working people than the right wing, which is more in favor of business. The other definition that I think is what we're talking about here is it's a series of political organizations that claim to be some representative of the working class or of the interests of the working class, and there are many of them. There are a whole bunch of them. So that's another definition of the left. That's more organization. The other one is more a mass kind of thing.
Would you want to answer, Ben?
Well, yeah, I would just say that the left is a huge umbrella term that includes a bunch of different political tendencies that often have very little in common with each other, apart from this claim that they mean in some way to care about people who work for a living. But in practice, they often have very different beliefs about how that is to be achieved. And the critique of these organizations, and it's a good critique, is that in general, the people who are in them are not actually from the working class, don't actually work for a living, and don't know a whole lot about what it is actually like to work for a living. So a lot of the time they misrepresent the interests of the people that they claim to represent. But because the left is an umbrella term, it's not one size fits all. And there are all sorts of different people who call themselves left-wing. If somebody says they're left-wing, you have to ask that question, what does that mean to you, before you really know whether they know what they're talking about.
Other questions? Yes.
Well, first, I wanted to respond to that question also.
Go for it.
For the panelists, and then I actually have a second question, which is itself a two-part question. But so just for the left, I just thought it was interesting that the entire panel was focused basically on class as a way of understanding what the left is. They said basically the left is oriented toward the working class, but maybe dishonestly or whatever, in a problematic way, but nonetheless it's oriented toward class. And we're just wondering, what about, the French Revolution with the focus on free, so the term goes back to the French Revolution with the sort of three-part focus on freedom, equality, and brotherhood. And so it's kind of interesting that the class emphasis, sort of maybe you could say it connects to one or two of those, but it sort of leaves freedom off the table. And I'm just kind of curious what the panel thinks about the concept of freedom as it relates to the left. So that's one question. And then the other question is really topical on this panel, so it's a two-part question. One is, are we witnessing the end of American hegemony? And the second question is, and that's like an analytic question, and the second question is that good or bad for the left?
Yes. Yeah. I think, I think that the, first of all, the French Revolution was fought, against the bourgeoisie, the aristocracy against the bourgeoisie. So there's some difference there. My life has been dedicated to fighting for democracy and for what I call freedom. And of course, Engels defined freedom as the cognition of necessity. And so what we fight for in freedom is the necessary things that people need in life: healthcare, education, housing, food, clothing. That's that's the basis for that. And do I think that the U.S. is in decline? Yeah, I think that the economy is destabilizing. As I said, it's capitalism is based on hiring people, and the technology is undermining that. It's throwing people out of work. It's not creating more jobs per se. All ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, right? There's a growth factor there too. And yes, that destabilization means that we have an opportunity. It gives me the opportunity to talk to people about the problems that are arising from that destabilization, and therefore allows me to do my organizing. So yes and yes.
Les?
Yeah, in my opinion, the U.S. As a nation, the ruling class and so forth of the U.S. is in decline. And one of the things that it can brag about is it has a very strong military. So the challenges to the U.S., even in a decline, and one of these is China, for instance, where the U.S. ruling class, especially under Obama, changed the orientation of the military toward the China pivot, I think it was called, but might have been something else. And basically, that's moving a couple carriers. It's sort of like a game, moving a few more carriers. And the result of this was a further development of arms within China and also North Korea. So it's a losing battle. But from the working class perspective, we need to educate. The working class needs to find a way to understand that this is not in our favor, even though it may seem like it, because we say America, it's our jobs and so forth. This is a America first, which is basically a very right-wing perspective, because it's the international working class we have to look at, and we have to show that that it's not in the interest of working class to militarily determine what other workers live under in other countries. So this is a pretty complex problem, because workers see in their own interest, many workers see in their own interest, holding off the hordes.
Well, I would say that freedom is also an umbrella term that has been understood in many different ways by many different sets of people. I think when we talk about what is the left, and we answer this question to somebody young, we tend to answer it in terms of what is it now or what is it recently. I think what it would have been described in the French Revolutionary context would today be somewhat anachronistic. And if you were to answer that question in that way, it could be misleading. At this point, a lot of the positions that are characteristic of the French Revolution are today positions that the right subscribes to in whole or in part. As far as the United States goes, a lot of people on the left would like it to be the case that American hegemony is fading or falling away. It's not. The gap between the United States and China is substantially smaller than it was 20 to 30 years ago, but the per capita output of China is roughly equivalent today to the Soviet Union in the 80s, while the United States is a richer country overall and a more powerful country overall than it was in the 80s. So while the gap has shrunk, and this has given elites in DC cause for concern, and it's motivated them to do the pivot to Asia, a pivot which also incorporates trade policy, the possibility of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the possibility of a trade war on China, the possibility of trying to prevent China from getting access to things like microchips. These are symptoms of a United States that is concerned about the rise of China, but that does not mean that it is the case that American hegemony is gone or that it has substantially faded. China is not yet to a point where it has the same amount of strength relative to the United States as the Soviet Union had in the 60s. In the 60s, the gap between the Soviet Union and the United States was smaller than the gap between China and the United States today. And I think that's very important to bear in mind. China is still much weaker than the United States. It's just a question of degree relative to the 90s, and the 90s were a ridiculous period of enormous American relative power.
Other questions? Desmond.
Bruce, you brought up military bases or America's military influence internationally. So I just wonder, what is the strategy against that military influence of the United States? I think Ben brought up, this idea of getting the soldiers on side, so to speak, getting the U.S. military soldiers on side, as like an idea about how to address this, but what's the strategy, just generally, for dealing with like American militarism, American imperialism? I guess this makes, if I could ask another question.
Go for it.
About Revolutionary War, right? Like we have these conflicts, sometimes directly against the U.S., sometimes not. I think it's curious today, like there seems to be more proxy conflicts with Israel and Palestine, and it's not like the Vietnam War where the U.S. is directly fighting a combatant. But what do we make of these conflicts? Are they like what makes them or makes them not revolutionary wars? For example, the war in Ukraine, or as you mentioned, the slave revolt of the Palestinians. What exactly makes that a revolutionary type of war?
Well, in answer to your first question is I've already talked about cutting the military budget substantially and ending the militarization of society. I think that's something that we have to take up as a demand. And the role of veterans is within that. My experience with veterans is pretty extensive. And first of all, most veterans that are in the military, most people, soldiers that are in the military are subjected to huge amounts of propaganda you wouldn't even believe if you haven't been raised on a military base or close to one. However, when they're deployed, they begin to face the reality of war. And we saw this in Afghanistan and Iraq. We saw it in Vietnam. We've seen it in many other places, even the African people that have been deployed to Africa. They come back and they recognize the role of the U.S. military. So then they are integrated into the civilian population, and I think then within our organizing of the working class, I recognize a special role for veterans who see a little bit farther, have a little bit more experience. They have organizational skills, but they also have the political recognition of the role of the military, and you can use them in leading the organizing within the working class. So that's sort of a response to your first question. What was the second one again?
On Revolutionary War.
Oh, the Revolutionary War. Revolutionary War, Vietnam was a revolutionary war. We went into what was a civil war. That was by the workers of Vietnam were rising up against the capitalists, and we went in and tried to defeat that. The Gaza is, in my view, I don't disagree with Les. It's more a slaughter than a war, but it was a slave uprising from some of the most oppressed people in the world. Against their oppressors, and so I mean that's the nature of a revolutionary war, right? That doesn't mean that they're going to win, and it doesn't mean that they're that everything is going to change. The response of Israel has been overwhelmingly brutal. I mean, it's unbelievable to talk about, and that shows who we're up against, right? I don't think the Russian and Ukraine war is a different situation. That the Russian interests were very much violated, and there were a whole series of steps that the U.S. took that impinged upon the interests of Russia, and that's a different kind of war, right? I don't think that's a revolutionary war in the same regard. It's a national defensive war by Russia against Ukraine. Well, I'm interested to hear other views on that.
Les, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I first want to disagree on the Ukraine war. It was Russia that invaded Ukraine. Regardless of what kind of provocations, NATO and so forth, they don't have a right to invade another country because they think they're being picked on by a third country. And so, in my opinion, this is a bourgeois national democratic position that a nation has a right to defend itself. And I'm not talking about this argument about Israel. I'm talking about in the case of Ukraine, and especially regardless of what but the main thing I want to talk about is the idea of the working class in this country beginning to move toward taking power. And actually, as I said earlier, the Democrats and Republicans will be the number 2 and number 3 parties. One of the things, as we start being seen around the world, this would be quite an event if the working class started, even politically in the electoral arena, started taking positions. And one of the first things we would say is we would end all support for these dictatorships. This is what the working class would need to come to and make it very, very clear. And the working class coming to power in this country would be a revolutionary event, and other countries would see that, and the working classes in these other countries would see that, and being told that the U.S. military is not going to intervene if the working class in this country comes to power will encourage revolutions in a lot of different countries.
Questions? Yes.
Yeah, well, this is my father speaking, so it kind of took a lot of my thunder on that last speech there. But I just wanted to say, ask the panelists to talk about a few, for lack of a better word, I would say, orthodox Marxist positions on a lot of the questions asked. The question that my daughter asked about the left. I mean, in 1848, Marx talks about, doesn't use the word left, but he's talking about what are communists in relations to the working class. You know, we're at the front as much as possible, helping to see the bigger question, the bigger picture as much as possible. But we're part of the working class. The working class is the subject of history, doing the changing of the social relations on a world scale. And the question Les has brought up about, I think we should openly be discussing, at least as, I know there's many political positions here, but as those who see themselves as communists, socialists in this line, is that the working class as a class can take power in the United States. And this, putting forward this position as the potential, has ramifications all over the world. It may be very difficult because of the relative strength of the ruling class in the United States, but once the working class has power, it becomes much, much easier to do the basic necessities of life, which are very necessary. 10% of the U.S. military budget, I believe your figure, could have consequences. Of course, capitalism can't do that. We need to talk about that. Why can't capitalism do that? Because it's structurally stopped. That's the basic contradiction that Marx talks about in Capital in the 1840s, right? In the 1850s, he's talking about this. It can produce all this stuff, and this stuff, I would say the stuff we're talking about now is not really new to capital. The AI and stuff like that may be qualitatively different to a degree, but it's basically constantly revolutionizing itself and constantly ripping itself apart. It's so powerful, it can produce so much of the necessities of life that it becomes a crisis, that it has to go to war to destroy the necessities of life which it produces, because it's trapped within the class-divided society. It's class, the ancient that has come up. Last point, if I could just ask the panelists to say, can we be a bit more ambitious in our perspective towards discussing with the working class as conscious revolutionaries? The point is to form a government in the United States. One of the first things, I think Les just talked about it, is not putting support to these capitalist regimes around the world that are attacking military. In other words, a retraction of those 800 military bases of using these resources for necessities of life, for rebuilding some of the great damage that the U.S. empire has done, etc. These are things that just discussing this in working class struggles, what's going on I think is very positive. Several speakers talked about it. I'll finish on this. The industrial working class in the United States, the small section of us that is unionized, just had a pretty good victory with auto workers. We just ratified the contract. It's not perfect, and we haven't reformed our organs of struggle to a degree that we need to. But this is very positive. The southern auto plants may start to be organized. The non-U.S. Auto plants may be starting to organize, and this may be a moment of the beginning of the U.S. working class starting to see its power to run society. And we would do a much better job. Last point I'll say is, right now the ruling class is really looking at its toes in embarrassment at how bad of a job they're doing. Right? Every week we get some child is shooting up their students in a school, or you see violence on the campuses here. You see the degradation of the Earth's resources that was referred to. They don't have any answers, right? They don't have a future. We've known this for 100 years. The working class does. And I think that's the more positive vision that I wouldn't call myself left, but the communists and revolutionists can put forward and help the working class to build the confidence to actually take part in the United States. So I was wondering if anyone comment on that.
So if I can just make sure I'm not making this too narrow, the question is, are the formulations that Marxism and communist movements forwarded historically still adequate to the political problems today? And secondly, is it appropriate to maintain those horizons, and what would be necessary to get there? Is that appropriate to?
Yeah, you're
okay.
moderated. Go for
Got
it.
it. So if anyone wants to respond to that.
Yeah, I think that you're making some very good points. I think if I have underestimated or understated one thing, it's the importance of the fact that the productivity in the economy is huge. There is no scarcity anymore. Capitalism creates that scarcity, but the ability of the economy to produce, we can feed everyone in the world, we can house everybody, we can provide health care for everyone. The very same labor replacing technology is creating abundance, and we need to recognize that. Second of all, I think everybody ought to study Marxism. I think everybody ought to go back, that's in the room at least, I think everybody anywhere, but go read the original sources and read Marx, read Engels, read Lenin, and read the other revolutionaries from history. I mean, that's what we really are based in. The third thing I'll say is everything goes through stages of development. Right? We can sit here and we can leap to we need socialism tomorrow, but that's not the case. We're going through stages of development, and the fact of the matter is the power of the capitalist class is very strong. Red baiting is very real, and the situation that the stage of development we're in today, I think, is characterized by the Poor People's Campaign of fighting for voting rights, fighting for health care, fighting for all the things that we've been talking about at this stage of development. The very action of doing that will confront the capitalist class, and does confront the capitalist class, and will create a reaction. And we'll then move to another stage of development. And I think the electoral arena where people are attempting to implement their program of ending poverty and things will run into the opposition of the capitalist class. And it already has. It's already being opposed, and we can see the extreme right is getting very powerful and is reacting to the fact that it's being destabilized. And so we have to look. I don't think we can organize the working class today on the basis of we need to take state power. We're not at that stage of development yet. That's the only thing I would say. I'm trying to talk about what stage we're at, and some of the discussion is the more strategic, long-run kind of approach.
Les?
Yeah, I agree studying Marxism, but you can go a little bit earlier than Marxism and actually quite a bit earlier than Marx. One of the things I studied quite a bit is a dude named Hegel. And one of the things Hegel talks about is under certain circumstances of the dialectic, where there's contending forces all over the place, is things can change very rapidly. So I don't think we should necessarily be conservative and say it can't happen. I think we should look at what's necessary, and at this point, we as a civilization, as inhabitants of the earth, are in a pretty precarious situation. And I want to talk about politics and not ecology at this moment. And the politics is wars and threats of wars and things like that. And there is China, the US, and other countries are upgrading their nuclear capabilities. Israel, one of the ministers or somebody got shoved out because he talked about using nuclear weapons in Gaza. It's being talked about, debated in Russia on whether to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
It's that he confirmed that Israel had nukes, that he said it positively when he tried to be ambiguous.
Israel has nukes, South Africa had nukes, and who knows who else. But it's a very dangerous situation, and it's becoming urgent that workers take power. And we should see it that way, and we should take aim at this lesser evil type of thing that we're sort of trapped in. So, and the other thing is, we've learned a lot from Marx's time. We had the Russian Revolution. We've had the German Revolution and so forth, and we've learned things from these things. You read Lenin and you learn things that Marx didn't understand. You read some Trotsky, there's some things that maybe Lenin didn't understand. And you read Che Guevara, there's even more things, and so forth. So we can't look at these things as a fetish. Well, Marx said this or Lenin said that. We have to think and not dismiss Lenin, but we have to think for ourselves.
That's right. Absolutely.
Ben?
Yeah, well, I of course think that we should read all kinds of old stuff. The task then is to see what still applies now and what's different about now. I think it's really easy to do historical analogy. Everybody loves to do it. Everybody loves to see some previous event in the current situation. Oftentimes it gives people hope because they see that people in the past did something and then some level of change happened, so they think, well, that's inspiring. But when I look at the world today, I tend to focus on the things that are different now that make it much harder than it used to be. And these are the problems I think we have to figure out how to deal with. So one of these is the primary system, which was created during the Vietnam War for the express purpose of making it impossible for a third party to be competitive or successful in the country. And increasingly, a lot of US states have rules that if you want to get on the state's ballot line, especially for high-profile races, you have to have a primary system in your party. And if you have a primary system in your party, then that means outsiders with money can infiltrate your party through the primary system and attempt to co-opt it. This is a huge problem with creating third parties that nobody in the states really wants to talk about. And it's why all of these different attempts to make competitive third parties that people have done over the last 50 years haven't worked. So we have to come up with a way to deal with that problem, for instance. Another thing that sticks out to me is the enormous level of capital mobility we have now. and the structural advantages that that gives capital in negotiating not just with workers, but with political elites. Even political elites that are interested in helping workers have to worry about capital flight, have to worry about whether they're going to be able to come up with enough revenue to pay for things. Now, oftentimes we try to get out of jail free by saying, we'll just take all the money from the Defense Department. But defense spending is about 3% of GDP, and healthcare spending in this country is about 17%. So if you want to create something like a single-payer healthcare system in this country, you need a lot more than the Defense Department money. That's not to say that the Defense Department money couldn't fund some stuff. You could fund tuition-free college 7 times over with the Defense Department budget. But tuition-free college is really cheap. The government just doesn't give that to you because it doesn't like you, right? Healthcare is really, really expensive. In this country especially, we've allowed that sector to become enormously large, and when sectors become enormously large, they develop a ridiculous level of political influence because there are so many jobs that depend on the sector. And this is a problem that afflicts not just countries like the United States, but it afflicts the Soviet Union, it afflicts China. China's dependence on the construction business. The Soviet Union in the 80s, its dependence on heavy industry. When you have an overdeveloped, highly inefficient sector, it becomes extremely difficult to reform it, even when the political will is there. And of course, right now in the States, the political will isn't there because the bulk of our representatives are constantly being bought off by the healthcare sector in all of its different forms. So these are a couple of the big key things that are very distinctive about now, that in the 19th century they didn't have to deal with. Indeed, in the early 20th century they didn't have to deal with. We have to deal with this stuff. And that means we have to be creative and we have to generate new theory. We can't just read the old stuff. But of course, reading the old stuff is good. It can break you out of your usual thought patterns, and it can help you get creative and think about things from new perspectives and new points of view.
So I'd like to ask, specifically in the context of the role of warfare in the political horizons of the left, despite what I think can be appropriately diagnosed as like the inadequate condition of the workers' movement domestically today, regardless of whether or not that's something that should be supported or not, what does comprise the left is interested in taking positions on conflicts internationally, that the left ought to support this versus that there are these conflicts that are more emancipatory or these conflicts that are less emancipatory. And I'd like to point to the prompt that historically, and again, also feel free to disagree, war has been interpreted by the left through categories like imperialism, national liberation, and solidarity. Now, I think we've talked a lot about the character of imperialism and how that shapes conflict. But what I'm interested in is whether, I guess, firstly, these categories are adequate, whether it's appropriate to read the correct approach that a leftist political movement ought to take, especially in lieu of political conflict, through something like national liberation. Is this the way that we ought to take up conflict and understand how it should relate to the domestic movement? And also something like solidarity. Is this the adequate approach for connecting the domestic left to the international left? I think, Les, you raised this somewhat. I guess to summarize the question, how are these categories still adequate, especially given that they seem to still be raised by the left in trying to parse the meaning politically of global conflict?
Go ahead.
Yeah. One of the things that the left, in my opinion, is clueless on is a lot of issues on, what is this? Who is the better of the two in a conflict and things like that. One of the things that I'm not prepared to do is to prescribe what should be done in the Israel-Gaza situation. One of the things that it's clear to me is to the extent that Israel is successful in dealing a very serious blow to Hamas, And I don't think Hamas is a progressive organization whatsoever, and I thoroughly condemn what they've done on October 7th. But to the extent that Israel is able to defeat Hamas, it's going to make their situation, it's going to make the Jewish situation worse. It's already given rise to a very dramatic increase in anti-Semitism, which I would prefer to call Jew hatred. And the people that are arguing these things generally don't understand the issues, they don't understand the history, they don't understand that they're pointing their finger at Israel, and they should be pointing the finger at the U.S. Israel isn't over any oil or anything else like that. Israel, the Zionist movement in the late 19th century and early 20th century was, in the words of one of the Zionists, was for Britain to put a little Ulster in Palestine in the middle of hostile Arab reaction. And that's basically what it was. And it was getting imperialism on their side. And as oil became more and more important, which was the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they started discovering, pretty serious oil fields. It became extremely important for imperialist powers to have control. And the United States was in the best position to do that and supplanted. But the United States is as an imperialist power is one of the ones responsible. And Israel and the Israeli Jews and the Palestinians are pawns in this whole thing, and it's getting worse. It's a bad situation. This is another reason why the working class needs to take power, needs to understand these issues, and start looking, developing a nose for power.
Ben, do you want to comment?
Yeah. I would say that these concepts tend to not be very helpful, I think, because they tend to be one-size-fits-all approaches for conflicts that are different from each other, where there's a lot of contingent details and features that you have to be intimately familiar with. We really need to stop thinking in terms of who's good and who's bad in these conflicts, and instead to start thinking about what would be a solution, a way in which these people could live together without conflict. What would that look like? That necessarily involves talking to the people who are involved in the conflict and getting a sense from them what kinds of solutions could they accept. So, for instance, when the Clinton administration tried to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Clinton administration said, let's do a two-state solution. The problem immediately becomes, to have an independent state, you have to have the right to build an army to defend that state. But any army that a Palestinian state would build, even if it intends to build that in self-defense, would be regarded by Israel as a potential threat to it. So Israel will only agree to a two-state solution if the Palestinian state is not allowed to arm itself. But a state which isn't allowed to arm itself doesn't have a monopoly on the use of force within the territory and isn't a functional state in the relevant sense. So the two-state solution that was offered in the 90s was inadequate, and there was no way of resolving that in a way that would make both sides happy. Israel would only accept a Palestinian state that was disarmed, and the Palestinian Authority would only accept a Palestinian state that had the right to defend itself. That impasse made the two-state solution impossible. Now, over time, you've got 600,000 settlers in the West Bank. Those settlers are very difficult to relocate, and this has made the two-state solution no longer something that can work. Nevertheless, a lot of Americans who are not familiar with these developments continue to say there's got to be a two-state solution. And a lot of the time when the left starts getting involved in these conflicts, people look it up, decide who they think is good or bad, and then say this is the solution. What we have seen is that really either one of two things is going to happen. Either there's going to be an ethnic cleansing of Gaza, or that's not going to be permitted because the states that would have to take the Gazan population for that to happen will refuse to do that. If that happens, then Israel will either have to commit an enormous amount of violence in the Gaza Strip, which it will not be possible for Israel to follow through with politically. Or what will happen is that Israel will have to, at some point, at some stage, back off, declare victory, say it has debilitated the capabilities of Hamas. That will put us back to square one. The only way in the long run that that conflict can be resolved is if Palestinians and Israelis find a way to live together in the same territory and to recognize each other as citizens of the same state on equal terms, with neither one trying to move the other one out of the territory, neither trying to remove the settlers from the West Bank nor trying to remove the Palestinians from the territory in which they live in, with free movement within the territory, so Palestinians can move anywhere they want within the territory of a federal state, and the same goes for Israelis. For that to happen, there has to be reconciliation. And for that reconciliation to happen, we have to stop referring to this as two different peoples with essences that go back in history. The category of the nation is anachronistic. It no longer serves a purpose for us. The problems of global capitalism today cannot be solved by nation states that are territorial, that do not have the capacity to govern the flows of money around the world. The nation state no longer works. The liberal conception which motivated the creation of the nation state was functional at a time when there was much less international trade, much less capital mobility, and these states could internally make their own decisions and take different paths. But with this level of integration, that's no longer possible. So we have to stop talking about nation states and the creation of nations for primordial peoples that don't really exist anyway, and start talking about how can people live together in the same polities, or in polities that have very close relations with one another, in federations, in republics, in other kinds of polities maybe. Maybe we will come up with new kinds of polities in the future to deal with these problems, large-scale polities that can deal with the flows. These are the things we need to talk about. Alternatives to things like the European Union that actually function in a way that manages the flows of money in Europe, in a way that works for people who live in, say, Greece, and not just people who live in, say, Germany. These are the questions we need to be answering. Not who's good, who's bad, who's a settler, who isn't. But unfortunately, the way that our conversation takes place is through a media that operates through a culture industry setting that encourages very nasty one-sidedness and undialectical, unsophisticated appraisals of these conflicts. The same thing is also the case in Ukraine, but that would be a whole different subject, and I've gone on long enough.
Bruce, I'll ask you to follow up, but I want to ask Ben a clarification on this. So you're sort of offering an analysis of the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and to broaden the question, but to use this as the example, you're giving basically these conclusions on the possible avenues that the conflict can sort of carry out in. And I guess the question I want to ask is, ought the left take a stance on what is likely to happen, or alternatively, is it appropriate to assume or believe that the left can have any sway today on the way that these will actually unfold? Like, should the left be taking stances on wars? Yeah. Is it conditional on its capacity to influence it? Should it try to influence these things?
Yeah, so for the left to be able to influence this in the United States, the left would have to credibly threaten to not vote for Joe Biden, which it can't do because it capitulated in 2020. For that reason, the left has no ability at all to oppose the foreign policies of Joe Biden. This is something I talked about at the time, that we were going to end up with, if we got Joe Biden would start conflicts he didn't promise to start. They would just come up somehow, just like they did with Obama and Libya, these conflicts that nobody ever runs on. They just come up. And then once they come up, because they know that you are more afraid of the Republicans than you are concerned about the lives of the people that are in play, they will test you, and they will see, well, are you really willing to actually vote for somebody else? And they're quite confident that the left will just line up and vote for Joe Biden no matter what he does on foreign policy. And they have every reason to believe that, because even as we speak, the left-wing media outlets that have been putting out stories about how terrible the policy is in Palestine are also putting out stories about how they think that Donald Trump will establish a fascist dictatorship if he wins. And every time they do that, every time they suggest that Donald Trump is a threat to establish an authoritarian or fascist state, they are saying implicitly to Joe Biden, we are going to support you no matter what you do. So go nuts.
Got it. Bruce, do you want to follow up on the questions and the discussion here?
Yeah. The point of organizing is not to convince people to believe what you believe. The point is to organize them on the basis of what they believe. And I do not believe that the working class in this country is reactionary. The poor and dispossessed in this country are fighting for food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, the right to vote, and the things that we're talking about. It's on that basis that we're going to organize people. And most of the left, in my experience, is attempting to get the working class to believe what they believe. That doesn't work. That's not the stage of development that we are at. The stage of development we are at is fighting for the basic necessities of life of the poor and dispossessed in this country. That's what I believe, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Questions in the back?
Yeah, so I know that, a lot of the conversation...
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Oh, sure. I know a lot of the conversation has been around war specifically, what's going on currently. But I'm curious as to what you think left perspectives on peace are, particularly when we're talking about like Scandinavian socialisms, right? You have some of the organization or organizing techniques that are being talked about, unions and UBI and nationalized healthcare and these types of things do become pacifiers to a certain degree that just continue a bourgeois state, right? As opposed to actually disrupting some of those processes. So I'm wondering what your perspectives are on the left's role in disrupting those while building to also disrupt the sort of war process as well.
It isn't the awarding of these things, it is the struggle to get these things that is crucial to organizing, right? We overcome racism by struggling for the basic necessities of life that are being denied people, not based on whether they're white or black or Muslim or Jewish or Christian, but based on their economic situation. And I believe that if you go out to the population, in my experience with going out and attempting to organize, they're all for peace. People are in favor of peace. They are not in favor of violence. And the violence in this society that we're seeing within our own society is a major issue that again, we need to struggle around gun control and things like that, right? It is the struggle for these things that is crucial.
I think I heard you mention Scandinavian socialism. One of the things about the U.S. military budget is, to a certain degree, and Trump pointed this out pretty clearly, to a certain degree, it relieves some of these nations, governments of these nations, the responsibility for their own defense. And many of these countries had very small defense budgets and pretty small armies. And with the Ukraine war, a lot of these countries have been arming quite a bit. And so that's changed. So the Scandinavian socialism is a luxury. It's a little bit like the United States. The working class is subsidized by a certain huge difference in the cost of labor outside the U.S. working class. And it's not the whole working class. Some parts of the working class are subjected much more to exploitation. The U.S. is primarily an agricultural export country. But the other thing I want to mention, in Israel, and this is true of it's true of everywhere, is Israel is a class-divided society. There are a ruling class and there are intermediate classes and there's working class. And in Israel, the working class that were Jews and working class that were Arabs, often, it isn't a huge number, but they often fought together. And so this is where we should be looking at for the ability, and this is a huge setback, in my opinion, with the conflict going on right now, is it's very difficult for either side, even workers, to join together. So we should look in that direction, though, and not see these countries as just one unstratified entity. And we should, as I said in the very beginning, we should be looking toward the interests of the working class, not what we prescribe for our capitalist class or other capitalist classes. We need to, the working class here needs to organize itself and discuss all these issues, and the ones that have some information should be part of that conversation.
The bottom line for me is political power. We need to organize to have political power. And without political power, we can, talk about this stuff all day long. We don't have the political power to change it, then it's not relevant. And we gain political power through the struggle for the basic necessities of life.
I'd like to get in on that one.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a distinction between reforms that have a palliative function, that do what you described, and reforms that increase the capacities of the workers to demand things and to think, right? The sweet spot politically is reforms that meet the immediate needs of workers while also at the same time expanding their capacities to think. Reforms that give them time, that give them energy, that give them education, that protect them from things that might otherwise disrupt their ability to think about stuff and think about what's good and what would be good for them to do. In a lot of these European countries, the internal democracy of the country might otherwise produce voting for left-wing stuff if it were not the case that these states are in NATO and appendage to the United States, or that they are in the European market, or that they're subject to these flows of capital. A state like France, it's very difficult to get the French to vote for the right apart from repeatedly economically punishing France. And that's because some of those socialist programs did have a positive effect on the consciousness of people in France, in addition to the immediate role they played in preventing the communists from staging a revolution there. At the same time, we cannot assume that anytime anybody promises any kind of petty benefit to the workers, that is going to improve their consciousness or improve their horizons. And I think in particular, the stuff that Biden came out with the Build Back Better plan is a really good example of palliative reforms that exist only to shut people up and not to give them any additional capacities. Things like one-off checks or cash transfers, things like tax credits. These things do not actually increase people's access to, say, higher education. They don't protect people against disease. They are ways of kicking things along. And so we have to be discerning when we look at particular reforms. At this stage, all of these European countries, they're all slowly seeing this system ground away as a consequence of the capital mobility that those states also are immersed in. Some of their internal democratic structures resist this and slow it down and delay it, but they can't ultimately prevent it because these states are all embedded in the system of capital mobility.
So we're pushing toward the end of our time. We may go a couple minutes over, but I'll say we can take one or two more questions before we have to shift into closing remarks. Is anyone want to raise a question? Yeah.
So I wanted to read a quote from Lenin, kind of bring him into the conversation.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Sure. So the quote from Lenin is as follows: "The bourgeoisie armed against the proletariat is one of the biggest fundamental and cardinal facts of modern capitalist society. And in face of this fact, revolutionary social democrats are urged to demand disarmament. That is tantamount to complete abandonment of the class struggle point of view, to renunciation of all thought of revolution. Our slogan must be arming of the proletariat to defeat, expropriate, and disarm the bourgeoisie. These are the only tactics possible for a revolutionary class, tactics that follow logically from and are dictated by full objective development of capitalist militarism. If the most reactionary of all wars is now preparing for that society and end to war, we have no reason to fall into despair. But the disarmament demand, or more correctly, the dream of disarmament, is objectively nothing but an expression of despair at a time when, as everyone can see, the bourgeoisie itself is paving the way for the only legitimate and revolutionary war, civil war against the imperialist bourgeoisie. So, this question is primarily directed against to Bruce, because I know you spoke about cutting the military budget and demilitarization, but I'd be curious to hear what other panelists have to think. But my question is, if Lenin could endorse militarism insofar as it brought about the arming of the working class, why then does it seem more desirable today to call for demilitarization, cutting the military budget, etc.?
Well, the militarization that we're fighting against is bourgeois militarization, is the militarization of military, an economy, a society that is built around the strength of the capitalist class through their military. Right. What he's talking about, what Lenin is talking about, is the arming of the proletariat in a revolutionary situation, which becomes obviously important. Right. Once you're in a violent revolutionary situation, the working class has to be armed in order to defend itself and in order to defeat the capitalists. That's not the stage of development that we're at today.
One of the things that I think is really important about that is you have to imagine what kind of army Lenin is talking about, which is a World War I army where everybody's got a rifle and the tanks are really terrible and there's no such thing as air superiority. So when an ordinary person has small arms in 1917, that person is competitively armed relative to a soldier. Right? We no longer live in that kind of world, so now when you are increasing the defense budget of the United States, you are creating this enormous gap between the armaments of the state and any armaments that any individual can acquire. And small arms acquired by large numbers of American civilians don't make any difference, really, unless the soldiers themselves are willing to defect and join the cause. And even in the case of 100 years ago during the Russian Revolution, the only way that Lenin could win was if soldiers defected and joined the cause. And it was because the soldiers were worn out by the war and no longer willing to fight it that they did that. So it's, I think, absolutely essential to think about what are the weapons the soldiers are actually fighting with? What are the weapons that ordinary people have? Are these things competitive? Do these things have anything to do with each other? This is a big reason why the guns debate, no longer remotely resembles anything like, the old Machiavelli argument about a citizen population that's armed can resist the state. A great example would be just look at Syria. So Syria is a state that has a much weaker military than the United States. And lots of people in Syria have got small arms. But Syria's got air superiority, so Bashar al-Assad can bomb and absolutely pulverize the rebels, even though they've got small arms. So you got to think about these other kinds of things, and they've really changed the whole context for revolutionary violence. It's now more essential than ever before that you have people in the military supporting revolutionaries for a revolution to come off. You're not going to acquire enough force external to the state to do it without defection.
I think we can take one more question. Desmond?
Right, on that note about, I just wanted to return to something that Ben said in the beginning, that the revolution only succeeds when the soldiers come over to decide the working class. We've been talking a lot about reforms and this stage, but let's maybe think ahead. Not only in America, but in Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Russia, what would it mean? Is it even possible today for a situation in which the soldiers can come over to the side of the working class, as they did in 1917? What would it mean for that to happen? Right, instead of, I understand this might seem crazy to say that. It's very understandable we'd be talking about reforms, but yeah, I'm just curious, I feel like the fact we're talking about reform so much maybe indicates we don't think it's possible for the IDF or the US Army to really be overpowered by the working class. What would that actually mean? It seems very pessimistic if we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
Yes. At one point, I talked about a Labor Party, and a Labor Party being the number one party and the Democrats and Republicans being second and third. And I don't think that's impossible. And I think it should be our goal. Not necessarily be the number one party right away, but within 2 election cycles, we should, if we're serious, we should become the number one party, the working class party. When that happens, and let's say there is that party elects a presidential candidate that is beholden to very democratic forms, like the Soviets, but not necessarily exactly like the Soviets. One of the things that we can say as the president, for instance, is, hey, I'm the commander-in-chief. And what this does is, right off the bat,
I'll be right back.
whatever politically is decided by this political party of the workers will be seen by workers in uniform. And as generals and so forth try to use heavy weaponry, they can't just do this without the support teams that are necessary. And I would anticipate that some things would happen, some very nasty things like bombing of a city or something like that. But in general, that would be the precursor to a revolution. It'd be the overthrow of the military top brass. And so the working class would have access to a military, and that military would potentially play a progressive role. I mean, it's not something, when you got power, you just don't disband your military. You put new leadership in charge, and you arrest a bunch of people and all that sort of thing. These are practical things that we have to think about going forward if we are serious about taking power.
Well, I would say not only is it an issue for revolution, it's an issue for reform, because reforms are often granted because of fear of revolution. So if you can't pose a revolutionary threat, you can't get reform. All of the reforms that we got in the shadow of the Soviet Union. The fact that the Soviet Union existed was frightening to the capitalists, and therefore this created an impetus to do reform. So I think that there has to be a credible threat of this, regardless of whether you actually want it to happen or whether you'd like to see reforms. You can have whatever view you want about ultimately what you'd like to see happen, but you have to have a credible threat. And the only way to have a credible threat is to have soldiers on board with the project. That means you need to have whoever's in your political movement has to also be in the army, so that these people are similar enough to each other that you can get that solidaristic relationship. So if you're going to have a left that is based on students and people with college educations and professionals, the only way that you could have that left have anything to do with a revolutionary workers' movement would be for those people to join the military, or to be made to join the military through a draft. Now, I would say to you quite plainly, I don't think the people outside are going to do that. I don't think they're going to join the military, and I don't think they're going to be happy about bringing back a draft, which means that the left is not going to be based on the student movement. This is the thing everybody in the 60s fundamentally got wrong. Everybody in the 60s thought, oh, we'll get rid of the draft. It'll be great. The young people won't have to go to war. The result of this is that now everybody who opposes the war, everybody who criticizes the American state, everybody who thinks that the police or the soldiers are the bad guys, none of those people are in the military, and the military doesn't like those people. Therefore, the left cannot be, or a working class movement cannot be of those people. It has to be of other kinds of people. That's not to say that nobody with a college education or nobody with a university background can be part of it, but very clearly, if the professional class is determined to have cushy desk jobs, then the professional class cannot be the revolutionary subject.
So we're gonna shift into closing remarks. Each speaker can have roughly 5 minutes to wrap up their thoughts, answer any strands that they feel warrants a little more discussion. Feel free to talk about whatever you feel is appropriate, but I'll point to 2 parts of the prompt that I think warrant consideration. First is the question, how have the categories of imperialism, national liberation, and solidarity changed for the left historically? You can also think of other categories if they're appropriate. And what is their relevance today? Additionally, what difference in political tasks, if any, do wartime versus peacetime present for the left, and should the left demand one over the other? Feel free to speak as appropriate.
Yeah, well, I think that war tends to suck all the energy out of the room. In terms of what's the difference between wartime and peacetime. Unless you have a mass mobilization army where a lot of the ordinary workers are in the army and therefore can react to the conflict as participants in it, the tendency is for everybody who isn't involved to just start talking about the conflict all the time. And because of the way that our media industry is constructed, this has a culture war kind of effect. Increasingly, we talk about foreign policy issues as if they were things like, say, abortion or gay marriage. And this means we talk about them in this very polarizing way, and it's about which side you're on. And the parties polarize. The Democrats and the Republicans pick different sides to be sympathetic to. And you end up in a conversation that is analogous to the very unproductive and unhelpful cultural conversations we've recently been stuck in. All of this takes us politically away from the issues these guys have been talking about. Healthcare, having enough resources to get food on the table, basic needs that people have, access to energy, access to time, the right to refuse work in addition to the right to a job. All of this stuff gets pushed off the table by war unless you're dealing with something like World War I, a mass mobilization war which breaks capital mobility and fundamentally disrupts the global economy. That creates an opening for something else. The tendency on the left, because everybody on the left wants to be the one who's there the day the revolution happens, is to say that every conflict and every crisis is the moment, is the one, and therefore it's to get completely absorbed with these issues. And the result of that is that you will end up going around and around in circles on issues that don't have a lot to do with the kitchen table needs of the workers. This will estrange you from the workers and remove you from them in terms of consciousness. And then it often means that people will end up deciding that because the good people need to win, that the workers need to endure the costs of the war. And that includes the domestic workers who have to endure additional costs for things like food, because there's a conflict going on in Ukraine, who have to put up with the inflation or the fuel costs associated with the Iraq war. People will rationalize forcing workers to deal with these costs and externalizing these costs onto the workers because they become absorbed in the perspectives of the combatants. And all of this makes it really, really hard for us to even be involved with the workers. And it has the same effect as the culture war issues that have been going on, which I think is really tragic because these issues are important. It's very, very vitally important what happens in Ukraine and what happens in Israel. But we, in the United States, because of what we've done with the 2020 election and Joe Biden, cannot influence these events. And as we talk more and more about these things and less about the economy, we are getting more and more removed.
Les?
Yes, I want to deal with a different category, and that category is division between different workers by sex, by nationality, by skin color, etc. And one of the most pernicious aspects of these divisions is Jew hatred. There's a long history of this, anti-Semitism, Jew hatred. And I have found much of the left is guilty of Jew hatred. Just the calling of people Zionist. I mean, it's like the pronoun wars. Well, they're Zionist. I mean, that's because you're not saying you don't feel comfortable saying, or you don't want to be exposed as saying they're fucking Jews. And so I think people are using the term Zionist to refer to Jews. And I think this is a serious problem, and it's part of what divides us. And if we can't understand this and be clear on it, the so-called left is not going to be a factor at all in the revolution.
Bruce?
Yeah. We're, in a university setting where we contemplate very big and very important issues all around the world and try to solve them in our debates and everything else. I think we need to be real about where the situation is in the United States today. And in the United States today, the reality is 140 million people that are poor, near poor, that are fighting for their daily bread on a basis. And that's what we're about. We're not about organizing the left, we're about organizing the working class. And that's an extremely, extremely difficult thing to do. The capitalists spend incredible, in the US state, right down to the city level and everything else, spends a lot of time keeping poor people fighting each other. If you want to take the migrant crisis, right, in Chicago is a very good example. They're setting up the migrants versus the homeless, right? The migrants are homeless, right? That's the same, they have the same situation as the homeless have. They've just gotten here more recently rather than having been here a long time. That's what's real. And that's what organizing the working class is, an extremely difficult situation where we're fighting the continual divisions based on race, based on religion, has been said, based on ethnicity, based on gender, right? And the entire realm of gender, based on just about anything they can do to divide us, they will. And we have to do what we can do to unite us. And that's where the struggle, that's the stage of development of the struggle today. I'm afraid we're not at the stage of development where we're going to take state power tomorrow. That's not the case, right? The case is we got to organize the most revolutionary section of the class. And that, by the way, isn't just in Chicago. That's also out in all the rural areas that we think of as Trump, the base for Trump, and everything else. There's a lot of rural poverty, and we've got to go out and organize those people too on the same basis. And the answer to the question is, if we have a serious level of organization of poor and working people, poor and dispossessed people in this country, we will also have a serious basis for compromising the military, to answer your question. But that's not the stage of development we're at now.
All right, thanks to all our panelists for a lively discussion. If any of you are interested in staying around, we will be going to Prairie Moon to eat and chat, and if you have other questions that you weren't able to ask during the panel, you can feel free to come around then. We have Platypus reviews over on the table there. If you don't have any and you would like to look into our publication, feel free to take all of them, but have a good night.